The mechanic's wrench slipped from his oil-stained fingers as he watched the young pilot officer walk across the dispersal at RAF Rochford, kit bag slung over his shoulder, heading towards the station commander's office. That made 3 this week. 3 pilots requesting immediate transfer from 264 Squadron. It was September 1940, and the Boulton Paul Defiant had become something worse than dangerous. It had become feared by the men ordered to fly it. The aircraft sat in its revetment under camouflage netting, looking deceptively purposeful with its distinctive power-operated turret protruding from behind the cockpit. 4 Browning 303 machine guns pointed skyward, ready to unleash 1-200 rounds per minute of coordinated fire. Everything about the design suggested innovation and lethality, but the pilots and gunners of Fighter Command had another name for the innovation. They called it the Defiant Death Trap. What made this rejection particularly devastating was the timing. Britain was fighting for survival. German bombers were crossing the Channel day and night, targeting airfields, factories and cities. Fighter Command was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Every Spitfire and Hurricane was precious, every squadron desperately needed. Yet here sat entire units equipped with brand new fighters that pilots actively refused to fly into combat. The aircraft's reputation had been sealed over Dunkirk in May 1940. The Luftwaffe, encountering Defiants for the first time, had initially mistaken them for Hurricanes and attacked from behind. The traditional fighter tactic. The results had been catastrophic for the Germans. Defiant turret gunners, with unobstructed fields of fire to the rear, had shredded Bf-109s and Bf-110s that foolishly positioned themselves behind the strange British fighters. For a brief, glorious moment, 264 Squadron had claimed 37 kills in a single day, and the Defiant looked like a revolutionary success. Then the Germans figured it out. The problem became apparent the moment Luftwaffe pilots realized that the Defiant had no forward-firing guns. None. 0. The entire defensive armament consisted of those 4 guns in the turret, which couldn't fire directly ahead because the propeller was in the way. A Defiant pilot couldn't dive on an enemy, couldn't fire during a head-on pass, couldn't even defend himself if the turret jammed or the gunner was killed. He could only maneuver the aircraft into position and hope his gunner could bring the guns to bear before an enemy fighter tore them apart. German pilots began attacking from the front quarter, where the Defiant was completely defenseless. They would approach head-on, fire a burst, then break away before the turret could track them. Or they would dive from high altitude, rake the Defiant from front to back, and climb away while the turret gunner desperately tried to traverse fast enough to return fire. The tactics were brutally effective. On July 19, 1940, 9 Defiants from 141 Squadron encountered a formation of Bf-109s over the Channel. Within minutes, 6 Defiants were shot down. 6 aircraft, 12 men, gone in the time it took to drink a cup of tea. The survivors limped home, their aircraft shot to pieces, their faith in the design shattered completely. Squadron Leader Philip Hunter, commanding officer of 264 Squadron, filed a combat report that should have ended the Defiant's daylight operations immediately. The aircraft is fundamentally unsuited for daylight fighter operations against determined opposition. Its lack of forward armament makes it defenseless in any engagement where the enemy maintains energy advantage. The additional weight of the turret degrades performance to the point where we cannot climb fast enough to intercept high-altitude raids or maneuver effectively in combat. I have lost 11 crews in 3 weeks. This cannot continue. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether you've heard about the Defiant's incredible transformation before. Drop a comment below about your favorite underdog aircraft story. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into aviation history that everyone else gets wrong, hit that subscribe button. These scripts take serious research to piece together, and knowing you're out there watching makes it all worthwhile. The Defiant's most damning flaw was written into its design specifications. The Air Ministry, in its wisdom, had decided in 1935 that future air combat would primarily involve bomber interception, not dogfighting. They envisioned formations of enemy bombers being attacked by fighters with turret gunners who could maintain sustained fire while the pilot concentrated on flying a steady intercept course. The concept assumed that enemy bombers would be unescorted and that dogfighting was a relic of World War I that modern air forces had evolved beyond. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Germans brought fighter escorts. They brought Bf-109s that were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with combat experience from Spain. The carefully planned bomber interception scenarios evaporated in the chaos of modern aerial combat, where survival depended on speed, agility, and the ability to point your guns at the enemy before he pointed his at you. The Defiant, designed for a theoretical future that never arrived, was obsolete before it entered service. By September 1940, Fighter Command had quietly withdrawn Defiance from daylight operations. The aircraft that had been built as a revolutionary bomber-destroyer was now sitting in dispersals across southern England, too dangerous to use and too expensive to scrap. Pilots transferred away at every opportunity. Ground crews worked on them with the grim knowledge that they were maintaining aircraft that killed the men who flew them. The Boulton Paul factory in Wolverhampton continued producing Defiance because the production line couldn't be easily converted, and Britain needed every aircraft it could build, even failures. Then the Luftwaffe changed tactics. On September 7, 1940, Hermann Göring ordered the Luftwaffe to shift from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London. The Germans would come at night, when RAF day fighters struggled to find them in the darkness. Britain's night defences in autumn 1940 were practically non-existent. The few night fighters available were Blenheims, twin-engine bombers converted to fighters that were too slow to catch German bombers. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the darkness, more for morale than actual effect. Searchlight batteries swept the sky, rarely catching anything. The Blitz had begun, and Britain had no effective way to stop it. Squadron Leader E.R. Thorne, newly assigned to command 264 Squadron after its mauling in daylight operations, looked at his Defiance with fresh eyes. Everyone had written them off as failures, but Thorne had flown night operations in World War I, and he understood something that the Air Ministry planners and Fighter Command headquarters had missed. The Defiant's weaknesses in daylight became potential strengths at night. That heavy turret that made the aircraft too slow for dogfighting. At night, speed mattered less than the ability to maintain station on a target while the gunner tracked and fired. The lack of forward guns that made the Defiant defenseless in turning combat. At night, you weren't dogfighting. You were hunting, getting into position, and delivering a killing burst before the enemy even knew you were there. The two-man crew that added weight and complexity. At night, having a dedicated gunner searching for targets while the pilot flew the aircraft was invaluable. Thorne began developing tactics specifically designed around the Defiant's capabilities in night operations. The key was using the turret's unique advantage. It could fire upward and to the sides without the pilot needing to maneuver the aircraft. This meant a Defiant could slide beneath a German bomber, matching its course and speed, and the gunner could simply elevate the turret and fire directly into the bomber's unprotected belly. No fighter with fixed forward guns could do this. A Hurricane or Spitfire pilot had to point his entire aircraft at the target to fire, which meant complex deflection shooting if the target was moving. A Defiant gunner could track independently, compensating for relative motion, firing from positions where the bomber's defensive gunners couldn't return fire effectively. The first real test came on the night of September 15, 1940. Flight Lieutenant Nicholas Cook, flying a Defiant with Sergeant Albert Lippett in the turret, was vectored by ground control toward a contact over southeast London. The primitive chain-home radar had detected a formation of German bombers approaching from the south. Cook climbed slowly, nursing his heavily laden Defiant to 15,000 feet, searching the darkness. Lippet spotted it first, a darker shadow against the stars, the distinctive silhouette of a Heinkel. He 111 caught briefly in searchlights. Cook throttled back, reducing speed to match the bombers, and positioned the Defiant below and behind. The Heinkel's crew had no idea they were being stalked. Their defensive gunners were scanning for conventional fighters coming from the side or rear, not looking down at the darkness beneath them. Lippet traversed the turret upward, the electric motors whining softly, and centered the bomber in his gun sight. At 50 yards range, he pressed the firing button. All 4 Brownings opened up simultaneously, tracer rounds arcing upward into the Heinkel's belly. The effect was immediate and devastating. Fuel tanks ruptured. The bomber's engines erupted in flames. Within seconds, the Heinkel was a falling torch, spiraling toward the Thames estuary, trailing fire. Cook and Lippet landed at dawn to find the station commander and the intelligence officer waiting for them. The confirmation came through hours later from Observer Corps posts on the ground. 1 Heinkel High 111 destroyed, crashed near Gravesend. It was 264 Squadron's first night victory, and it had been achieved using tactics specifically designed around the Defiant's unique capabilities. More importantly, it proved something nobody had considered. The turret fighter, written off as a daylight failure, might be exactly what Britain needed to fight the night bomber offensive. The successes began accumulating slowly at first, then with increasing frequency. Squadron Leader Thorne's tactics spread to other Defiant units. Pilots and gunners learned to work as true teams, the pilot handling navigation and positioning while the gunner searched, identified, and destroyed targets. The combination of primitive radar vectoring, searchlight illumination, and the Defiant's ability to fire from below transformed Britain's night defense. By October 1940, Defiant squadrons were claiming kills almost nightly. German bomber crews, accustomed to operating with relative impunity in the darkness, suddenly found themselves under attack from an enemy they couldn't see coming. The psychological impact was significant. Bomber crews reported being fired on from below, describing attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. The Luftwaffe's night bomber offensive, which had been grinding down British morale and industrial capacity, began suffering unsustainable losses. The pilot who truly mastered the Defiant in night operations was Squadron Leader Desmond Hughes of 264 Squadron. A methodical, quietly competent officer who had survived the squadron's daylight disasters through skill and luck, Hughes recognized that successful night fighting required system and patience rather than the aggressive initiative that characterized day fighting. Hughes developed what he called cooperative interception, a carefully coordinated process involving ground controllers reading radar plots, the pilot maintaining precise altitude and heading, the gunner searching systematically, and both crew members communicating constantly. His logbook from late 1940 shows the evolution of his technique, with increasingly detailed notes about radar vectors, searchlight cooperation, and gunnery solutions for different approach angles. On the night of November 22, 1940, Hughes and his gunner, Sergeant Frederick Gash, demonstrated the fully developed system. Vectored by ground control toward a large German raid approaching Birmingham, they intercepted a formation of Dornier 17s at 12,000 feet. Hughes positioned below the formation, matching their heading and speed. Gash methodically worked through the bombers, destroying 3 in 15 minutes, each from the classic position below and behind, where the Defiant's turret had perfect firing geometry, and the bombers' defensive guns couldn't depress far enough to return fire. The attack broke up the German formation, forcing bombers to scatter and jettison their loads early. Ground controllers vectored Hughes toward another formation. By dawn, his Defiant had claimed 5 German bombers destroyed, the highest single-night score achieved by any British night fighter to that date. Hughes would finish his tour with 18 confirmed night kills, all achieved in an aircraft that had been written off as unsuitable for combat. His success wasn't individual brilliance overcoming a poor design. It was the result of matching the aircraft's capabilities to an appropriate mission in a carefully developed tactical system. The Defiant's night-fighting success began filtering back to the Air Ministry and Fighter Command by late 1940. The initial reactions were skepticism and confusion. The same aircraft that had suffered catastrophic losses in daylight operations was now achieving results that rivaled Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons. Some senior officers dismissed the reports as statistical anomalies or credited the success to improved radar and ground control rather than the aircraft itself, but the evidence was overwhelming. Defiant squadrons were consistently outperforming other night fighter types. More significantly, the tactics developed by Defiant crews were teaching Fighter Command how to conduct modern night interception operations. The integration of radar vectoring, ground control, and airborne interception that became standard in RAF night fighting was pioneered by pilots and gunners flying an aircraft everyone had wanted to forget. By early 1941, Fighter Command was actively requesting more Defiants for night operations while simultaneously refusing to use them in daylight. The same aircraft existed in two completely different realities: a dangerous failure in day combat, a valuable asset in night operations. The contradiction forced British aviation designers and tacticians to confront uncomfortable truths about design requirements, operational employment, and the difference between theoretical capability and practical effectiveness. The lessons from the Defiant's contradictory service record directly influenced the development of Britain's purpose-built night fighters. The Bristol Beaufighter, entering service in late 1940, incorporated many concepts validated by Defiant operations. It carried radar for autonomous target detection, heavy forward-firing armament for the pilot, and importantly, provisions for a dedicated radar operator in a second seat, the crew coordination model that Defiant pilots and gunners had proven essential for night operations. The de Havilland Mosquito night fighter, which would become the most effective Allied night fighter of the war, took the lessons even further. Its performance envelope allowed it to catch any German bomber. Its AI radar gave it autonomous search capability, but its two-man crew arrangement and tactical employment doctrine came directly from experience gained with Defiance, the pilot flying the intercept while the navigator Johnny radar operator managed detection and provided target information. When Wing Commander John Cunningham, the RAF's most successful night fighter pilot, began achieving his legendary success in Beaufighters and Mosquitoes, he credited much of his tactical development to studying Defiant operations. The turret fighter chaps worked out how to hunt at night when nobody else had a clue, he wrote in 1943. They taught us that night fighting was about patience, system, and crew coordination, not individual heroics. Everything we did in Beaufighters built on foundations they laid. The Defiant service in night operations continued through 1941, gradually being supplemented and then replaced by Beaufighters and Mosquitoes. By mid-1942, most Defiants had been converted to target tugs or reassigned to air-sea rescue duties. The aircraft that had been too dangerous to use in daylight and too valuable to waste at night found new purpose in safer roles, training gunners and towing targets for anti-aircraft artillery practice. Total Defiant night victories are difficult to confirm precisely. Records from night operations were notoriously incomplete, and many kills were shared between fighters, searchlights, and anti-aircraft fire. Conservative estimates credit Defiant squadrons with over 150 confirmed kills during the Blitz, with the true number possibly much higher. These were bombers that would otherwise have reached their targets, dropped their bombs, and killed British civilians. More importantly, The Defiant's night operations forced the Luftwaffe to develop countermeasures that reduced bombing effectiveness even when raids succeeded. German bomber crews began flying higher to avoid the Defiant's preferred attack zone, which reduced bombing accuracy. They scattered formations to prevent multiple kills during single interceptions, which complicated navigation and targeting. They diverted aircraft and resources to develop night fighter escorts and electronic countermeasures, efforts that might otherwise have been spent on offensive operations. The fighter that nobody wanted had become the foundation for a defensive system that helped save Britain during its darkest hours. By 1944, when the last Defiants were finally retired from active service, the aircraft's reputation had undergone a complete transformation. Aviation historians and military analysts began seriously examining how the same design could be both a catastrophic failure and a significant success. The answer revealed uncomfortable truths about procurement, doctrine, and the gap between theoretical design and operational reality. The Defiant had been designed to specifications based on flawed assumptions about future air combat. When employed according to those assumptions, daylight bomber interception without fighter opposition, it failed catastrophically. But when creative, desperate pilots and gunners found a mission that matched the aircraft's actual capabilities rather than its intended role, the design proved remarkably effective. This lesson influenced British military procurement for decades. Design specifications began including realistic threat assessments and operational scenarios. The assumption that new designs would be employed exactly as intended was abandoned in favor of flexibility and adaptability. Most importantly, the recognition that failure in one context didn't mean failure in all contexts became embedded in how the RAF evaluated and employed aircraft. The Boulton Paul factory in Wolverhampton, which had built over 1,000 Defiants during the war, never produced another fighter aircraft. The company shifted focus to gun turrets, ironically the component that had made the Defiant both a failure and a success. Boulton Paul turrets equipped virtually every British heavy bomber during the war, from Wellingtons to Lancasters. The expertise developed creating the Defiant's power-operated turret became the company's most valuable contribution to Britain's air war. Today, only one complete Defiant survives. It sits in the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, restored to represent the markings of 264 Squadron during the Blitz. Museum visitors typically walk past it quickly, drawn to the Spitfires and Hurricanes that represent Battle of Britain heroism. The placard describes it as an unsuccessful day fighter that found limited success in night operations. An assessment that is technically accurate but misses the profound significance of the aircraft's story. The Defiant represents something more fundamental than success or failure in combat. It represents the dangerous gap between theory and reality in military design, the critical importance of matching capabilities to missions, and the creative adaptation that desperate circumstances demand. It demonstrates that genius and failure often coexist in the same design, separated only by how and where that design is employed. The engineers at Boulton Paul, who designed the Defiant with such confidence in 1937, never intended to create a controversial failure that would find redemption in an entirely different role. They had envisioned an innovative fighter that would revolutionize bomber interception with its turret-mounted firepower. When their creation was rejected as a death trap after the disasters over Dunkirk and the Channel, it must have been devastating. Yet their design choices, even the ones that failed, contributed to understanding how night fighting actually worked. The two-man crew configuration became standard for radar-equipped night fighters. The emphasis on gunner visibility and fields of fire influenced turret design across British bomber forces. The hard lesson that theoretical doctrine must match operational reality shaped British air power development for the rest of the war and beyond. The pilots and gunners who flew Defiants into the darkness over Britain in 1940 and 1941 demonstrated a different kind of courage than the celebrated fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain. They flew aircraft their service had rejected, using tactics developed through trial and error against an enemy they could barely see. They turned the most mocked fighter in the RAF into a weapon that helped blunt the Luftwaffe's bomber offensive and taught Britain how to defend its cities at night. Squadron Leader Desmond Hughes, who survived the war with 18 night victories in Defiance, wrote in his memoirs in 1978, "They called it the worst fighter in the RAF, and in daylight perhaps it was. But in the darkness over London, when German bombers were killing civilians and we were the only thing standing between them and their targets, the Defiant was exactly what we needed. It wasn't the aircraft we wanted, but it was the aircraft we learned to master, and that made all the difference." The story of the Boulton Paul Defiant challenges comfortable narratives about aviation progress and design success. It reveals that effectiveness is always context-dependent, that the same aircraft can be both inadequate and excellent, depending on mission and employment. It demonstrates that innovation sometimes emerges from desperation, and that the path to victory is rarely the one planned in peacetime. British aviation designers who initially rejected the turret fighter concept later incorporated its lessons into every successful night fighter. RAF pilots who learned night fighting in Defiance went on to achieve legendary success in Beaufighters and Mosquitoes. The tactical doctrines developed by Defiant crews became the foundation for integrated air defense systems that protected Britain for decades. The fighter that pilots refused to fly became the teacher that showed Britain how to win the night war. When the first production de Havilland Mosquito night fighter took to the skies in 1941, carrying the radar and crew coordination systems that would make it the war's most successful night fighter, it embodied lessons purchased with Defiant crews, lives and ingenuity. The turret was gone, replaced by fixed forward-firing cannon. The performance had been transformed by a brilliant airframe and powerful engines, but the fundamental approach, two-man crew coordination, radar vectoring, attack from below, system over heroics, came directly from pilots and gunners who had figured out how to make an obsolete day fighter into an effective night fighter through pure determination. The Defiant death trap had become the foundation for British night air defence. The few surviving photographs of Defiant crews from 1940 and 1941 show young men in leather flying gear standing beside their aircraft with expressions that mix pride and wariness. They knew they were flying an aircraft their service considered inadequate. They knew the Spitfire and Hurricane pilots looked down on them. But they also knew that when darkness fell and German bombers came, they were the ones climbing into that darkness to find and destroy them. Sometimes the machines we reject teach us more than the ones we celebrate. Sometimes the worst design in daylight becomes the best weapon in darkness, and sometimes failure becomes the foundation for everything that follows, not in spite of its flaws, but because those flaws forced innovation, creativity, and a deeper understanding of what actually matters in combat. The Boulton Paul Defiant was never the fighter the Air Ministry wanted, but in the hands of pilots and gunners who refused to accept that it was useless, who studied its capabilities and found missions where those capabilities mattered, it became something more valuable than a successful design. It became proof that adaptability, creativity and determination can transform even the worst failure into a foundation for victory. And in the darkness over Britain, while London burned and German bombers fell from the sky in flames, that was exactly what Britain needed.